Economists, politicians, pundits, they all insist recovery is right around the corner. It's at hand, it's a little slow, but things are going to get better. But unemployment remains high. Real estate values continue to sink. Governments around the globe stagger under record deficits. Today's guest, Richard HEINBERG, has a new book, The End of Growth, in which he proposes a startling diagnosis. Humanity has reached a fundamental turning point in its economic history. He talks about the new normal, a reality that recognizes the limits to growth imposed by resource and disposal limits, climate change, and population growth. Now, I've been following HEINBERG's work since his first book, A New Covenant with Nature. And I'm going to ask him actually about some of. I remember in that one he said, there's three possible scenarios, and two of them weren't very good. And so I'm going to ask him how. I don't even remember exactly how long ago it was, but I'm going to ask him how things have gone since then. And it should be interesting. Richard's been thinking about a lot of the questions that people don't like to think about for quite a while. Richard HEINBERG is a senior fellow in residence at the Post-Carbon Institute and the author of 10 books, including A New Covenant with Nature, The Party's Over, Peak Everything, and his latest, The End of Growth, Adapting to Our New Economic Reality. Welcome again, Richard HEINBERG.
Well, it's good to be speaking with you again, Terence. Thank you.
I do want to start by asking you a little bit about, as I do almost every week, about your path to the work you're doing today. In other words, how did you get into the focus you have, and what brings you, not so much to this latest book, but kind of, over the last 20 years or so, how you've chosen the things you focus on and the things you keep paying attention to and so on.
Yeah. Well, back in 1972, when I was 21 years old, I read a book called The Limits to Growth.
As did I.
And that went on to become the best-selling environmental book of all time. And it changed my life. It made me realize for the first time in my life that the society I had grown up in was fundamentally unsustainable, that we were going in a direction that would, if continued, ultimately lead to economic and social collapse. So I've basically spent my entire adult life trying to figure out why that's the case, how we got on this path, what the implications are, where we are on that path, and how we can change course. And that's led me through all sorts of different interesting side trips. My very first book actually was one called Memories and Visions of Paradise, where I looked at world mythology as possibly having clues for how we got off track. And I found that, for example, all civilized societies in the world, whether they're in India, China, whether they arose in the Middle East or wherever, all have a myth of a lost golden age or a lost paradise. But on the other hand, almost no hunter-gatherer societies have that kind of mythology. So that kind of suggests that maybe agriculture itself was kind of a turning point along the way where we lost some essential connection with nature. And I explored that further in the book you mentioned, A New Covenant with Nature. But toward the end of the 1990s, I began to realize that there was something that was missing from that analysis, which was the importance of the Industrial Revolution. So much has changed in just the last 200 years. We've grown our population from under 1 billion to 7 billion today. We've dramatically expanded our ability to shape the face of nature, of the planet we live on in order to support more human beings. And much of that influence has been pretty detrimental in terms of species extinctions, change of climate, and so on. So why all of this just in the last 200 years? And the answer, pretty obvious, but it came like a lightning bolt when it finally hit me, is fossil fuels. And the dramatic increase in energy available to human beings. And, of course, fossil fuels not only have environmental impacts when we burn them, but also they're finite. They only exist in certain quantities, and so the next question was, well, how serious a problem is that? and that led me to write another 5 books on oil depletion, coal depletion, and other fossil fuel supply issues. And then once I had kind of integrated all of that material, I realized that all of that would have implications for the financial system, which is based on the expectation of perpetual growth in energy and the economy. So that's really the subject of this latest book, The End of Growth. And I have to say the timing turned out, fortuitous for the publisher, I guess, and for me, but not so good for the world economy because as we know, the situation is pretty dire.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was not sure which came first, the chicken or the egg there, whether the crisis made this book inevitable or whether this book was in process as the crisis happened. And it sounds like it's the latter.
Yeah, I had started working on this issue prior to the crisis, and then in September 2008, when Lehman Brothers was collapsing, it just became obvious that this was what I needed to work on, and I started talking to all kinds of people who might be knowledgeable and helpful in this. I spoke to former Wall Street insiders, the former managing director of J.P. Morgan, hedge fund managers, economists of all stripes, as well as the usual resource specialists and world food experts and so on. And the picture that very quickly emerged was that this is not an ordinary recession. This is not just a downturn that's going to end in an uptick. What we're seeing is a fundamental shift in the world economy away from the paradigm that we've seen just over the past few decades. Many people think that economic growth is just normal and natural and it's been going on for centuries, but that's really not true. It's just the past few decades that we've seen economic growth, in the range of 2-3-5% or more. And that paradigm is not only fundamentally unsustainable, it's actually coming to an end right now as we speak.
And as you point out, that phenomenon really began with the injection of fossil fuels.
Right. Well, I wanted to illustrate just how fossil fuels have helped us get into this situation. The story starts around the year 1900. At that time, oil and coal were really taking over as fundamental energy sources for the U.S. We'd relied on firewood as our main energy source until the 1880s, then coal, then with the 20th century oil. And it gave us a problem, which was we could make stuff faster and in larger quantities than people could buy it. It was the problem of overproduction. And we solved it in 2 ways. First, through advertising, talking people into thinking they needed more things. And then the second strategy was consumer credit, making it easier for people to go into debt to buy stuff. And these strategies really came to focus with the automobile because it was a big-ticket item, and people perceived it as a luxury object. However, industry was capable of producing these things in astonishing numbers. So, of course, the way to do it was to advertise cars, and the car companies became consumer credit bureaus. So the problem is more or less solved, but the result is that debt grows with every passing year. Now, it's not that in itself is not a problem at first because debt and GDP are growing roughly at the same rate. The total amount of money being spent in the economy and the total amount of debt are growing at about the same rate. Until we get to the 1970s, and in the 1970s, 3 things happen. Globalization starts as a result of container shipping and satellite communications, but then globalization has the effect of pushing down wages in the already industrialized countries like the U.S. U.S. workers are now competing against workers in other countries around the world. So if American workers don't have more money to spend, how are they going to consume more? How are they going to buy bigger houses, bigger cars, more flat-screen TVs, and all that sort of thing? Well, the way they do it is with more debt. So starting in the 1970s, debt is increasing faster than GDP. So that's a recipe for debt and credit bubbles, which begin to appear.
Yeah, let me just cut in for a sec and don't lose your train. But so I just want to see what we've got here. So it turns out the 70s, is the beginning of globalization, so wages go down. The
Right.
70s is also the end of the U.S. as the number one producer of oil in the world.
That's right.
And that makes a big change. Real wages in America have never gone up since we stopped being the number one producer of oil in the world. And this culture that has gotten used to debt sort of gets used to then more and more debt.
That's right.
Okay.
And we make it easier and easier for people to do that with house mortgages and with credit cards and all sorts of things that make it easier for people to go into more debt. Now, all of this new debt, if you're the person taking on the debt, that's an obligation. But if you're the institution issuing that debt, if you're a bank, well, that's an asset.
I know that's always been an interesting thing to me. And it really became clear in this recent crisis that basically, when I've done the reading and a lot of it on the crisis, that basically debt is to certain players just as if they found a gold mine or just as if they bought some new land. Right.
Well, when they issue that debt, they're essentially creating money out of nothing. If you're a commercial bank and you make a loan, let's say for $10,000, you don't go into the vault and look around for $10,000 that's just sitting there not doing anything. You create that $10,000 with a few computer keystrokes, so that becomes an asset for the bank. And all of these new assets that are appearing with the enormous growth of debt starting in the 1970s and 80s results in the increase in size of the financial industry as compared to the rest of the U.S. economy. So manufacturing becomes less and less a part of the U.S. economy, and banking and other financial institutions become a larger and larger proportion of the economy. It's called financialization of the economy.
Right. So when we were talking, it seemed to me for years about service industries, and we were saying, America is shifting from manufacturing to service industries. That, I think to people that meant, okay, I'm doing knowledge work now,
right.
Perhaps, or I'm also slinging burgers. But I think they allowed themselves to think, well, it means we're doing more knowledge work. What actually was happening was that the service industry that was eating up most of that growth was the financial industry. It went from, I believe, from 7% to at least 20% of the economy.
That's right.
And now the other thing that isn't a piece of yours, but I'm just going to throw in there is healthcare also went from somewhere under 10 to almost 20%. And for me, the perspective of an economy that has 20% healthcare and 20% finance is just really not producing much and sounds a little shady to me.
It's becoming a very lopsided economy.
Yeah.
But in the process, of course, what happens with the financialization of the economy, as the financial institutions get more powerful economically, they also become more powerful politically. And during the time we're talking about, the last couple of decades, financial institutions begin contributing to political campaigns in ever larger amounts. And the result of that, then, is that politicians in Washington start to change the rules on Wall Street to make it easier for banks to engage in shady practices. In fact, what happens is broad-scale corruption. And we usually define corruption as just a few bad actors breaking the rules. But what's happened here is it's not unprecedented in history. It's happened in many, many nations. But what's happened is the rules have been changed to make corruption legal, whether it's within the political system, making it legal for campaign contributions from corporations to effectively buy politicians, or making it legal for financial institutions to engage in both commercial banking and investment banking, so as to blur the lines that were drawn back in the 1930s to prevent another financial collapse such as occurred in 1929. Many, many other instances could be cited. There have been whole books written about this. But
that's right. Yeah, Winner Take All Politics by
exactly.
Hacker and Pearson is an excellent example that really traces traces that exactly, that the rules just changed. Now, one thing they say, by the way, is that the rules changed more in the U.S. than they did elsewhere, and that the U.S. somehow suffers a worse case in this than most of the developed countries. And the other thing they say is that the U.S. adapted its rules less as the game changed.
Right.
You know, so as derivatives became a big part of things, other countries made some prudent sort of breaks on the speed of that. We did not.
Right, but the problem spread nevertheless and infected virtually every country. And just one example of how that happened: Greece hired Goldman Sachs on Wall Street to cook its financial books so that it could get into the EU.
Yep.
Now, that actually wasn't illegal. If Greece had been a corporation, that actually would have been technically illegal. But there's no law on the books that prevents Wall Street from cooking the books of a sovereign country. So perfectly fine. But the result of that, of course, is the Greek debt crisis now that's threatening to bring down the global economy, yet again, plunges into the same kind of crisis we had with Lehman Brothers in September 2008.
Although I think you would agree with me that I think that what's different is I think the next one is worse. In other words, I think each time the bubble bursts, it's worse because it's usually been some other bubble that's been able to take us, save us from our own bubble.
I do agree with that, and it's partly because we've run out of ammunition. The central banks and the governments like Germany that actually can afford to still bail out other economies are running out of ammunition. We've already had enormous bailouts and loan guarantees from the Fed and the Treasury and from the Chinese government, the German government, and so on. And there's not much wiggle room left for more giant bailouts. So that's one problem. The other problem is that we've gotten ourselves into a growth crisis because of the bursting of the mortgage bubble and the coincident convergence of two other enormous baskets of factors. We're seeing growth not returning to the industrialized countries, and without more growth, that means that tax revenues are down, and it becomes more and more difficult to solve the debt crisis that would otherwise be resolvable.
Right. In other words, it seems to me on every scale, individuals were banking on, as it were, when they got into trouble, they'd rely on their credit card or their house. Governments would rely on other things, and something was always sort of backing up, and that our ability to have a safety net and to back up is what's decreasing. Now, how do you link that? And I'm speaking with Richard HEINBERG about his newest book, The End of Growth, Adapting to Our New Economic Reality. How do you link that to the larger resource resource crises that we're facing, whether it's in terms of peak fossil fuels or peak disposal or growing population?
Right. Well, see, here's the nub of the problem. If the debt crisis were the only crisis facing us, it would be enormous, but it would be solvable. We could reinvent the financial industry. We could nationalize the banks. There are various things that we could do. And then, according to economic theory, the wheels of commerce would start turning again, economic growth would pick up, and all would be well. But unfortunately, as I said, there are two other converging baskets of factors. I call these all together the 3 Ds, debt, which we've just talked about, the second one, depletion, and the third, disaster. So depletion, of course, has to do with the fact that we're using up Earth's non-renewable resources at ever-increasing rates, and starting with the very resources that enabled all of this economic growth to happen, namely cheap, abundant, highly concentrated fossil fuels. It's not that we're running out of oil or natural gas or coal, but we've picked the low-hanging fruit, which means that with every passing year we're having to dig deeper, refine lower-grade ores, And the environmental consequences of doing so are also increasing. So that's why we're seeing oil at $100 a barrel instead of $20 a barrel, which was what the Department of Energy was forecasting for right about now.
Oh, my gosh. So let me tell people again, I'm Terrence McNally. The voice you hear is Richard HEINBERG, author of The End of Growth, Adapting to Our New Economic Reality. And you can learn more at two different websites, richardheinberg.com or postcarbon.org. That point that we've reached that limit on the fuels at the same time as the debt, how are they linked?
Well, it's an interesting thing. It's maybe a little subtle, but what happened over the course of the 2000s as we were blowing that enormous real estate bubble, it started to come apart. The bubble started to burst, interestingly, in the suburban communities where people had the longest commutes. We're talking about a period of time when oil prices were rising and rising and rising, and they hit their peak in July 2008 at almost $150 a barrel. And at that point, people in those outer-lying suburbs with the big SUVs were paying well over $100 to fill up the tank of their car. And suddenly they didn't have enough money to pay their credit card bills or their mortgage payments. And that's where the real estate bubble started to burst. Housing values in those outer suburbs started to plummet, and then it spread like wildfire throughout the rest of the housing market.
It's interesting. You live up in Northern California. I'm here in Los Angeles. But one of the Central Valley, even though it's also a large agricultural community, is an example of this. But what's called the Imperial, basically Riverside, San Bernardino, that area is really the poster child for what you're talking about, isn't it? I heard that unemployment there is really around 40%. And it was, it's an area that both had long commutes and an awful lot of subprime mortgages, and it's just, in some sense, it's the saddest example of what's been happening. Although right near where you are, the city of Vallejo basically went broke.
Is bankrupt, that's right.
And is running it's phenomenal. I interviewed Michael Lewis recently, and in his recent article in Vanity Fair about California, he talks about Vallejo, and I hadn't even realized it had gotten that bad.
Yeah. Well, even where I am in Sonoma County, as a result of declining tax revenues, the county has announced that it's going to let 90% of county roads revert to gravel just because there's no money left to repave them.
And this is, you're talking about Sonoma, which in most people's, imagery is a wonderland.
It's a paradise.
Yeah.
It's wine country.
Yeah, it's vacations, it's expensive inns and all of that sort of thing. This is amazing. I wanted to return, actually, when you were talking about peak oil, what people, if there's anyone out there to which that's a new term, it basically means the point at which we've gotten half of the oil that we think there is, and we've gotten it out and we've used it and so on. And as you point out, someone might say, only half? 100 years, right. 120 years, half, and we're in fine shape. But as you point out, the half we got is the cheap half. And
right.
The BP oil spill, you point out in your book, is an example of where we are now.
That's right. It's getting more and more expensive to find and produce new oil. There's still oil that can be produced cheaply, but the world wants ever-increasing increments of new oil, and that costs more and more, and that drives up the cost of all oil. So what's happening is, actually, James Hamilton, who's a professor of economics at UC San Diego, has done some great work on this. He's shown that there's a clear link between the price of oil and economic recessions. Every time we've had an oil price spike in the last 40 years, we've had a recession immediately following. Well, the problem is now the price of oil that the industry needs in order to go out and find and produce new oil is getting up to the point where it causes the economy to go into recession. So you can almost see this on a daily basis by watching the oil prices. Every time there's good economic news, the oil traders think, oh, well, this is going to push up oil demand. The price of oil goes up, and that starts to, a few weeks later, that starts to bring the economy back down to its knees, which then causes the oil price to moderate a little bit. We've reached a point where the oil price is effectively a cap on economic growth here in the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting. Lester Brown, who I'm sure you're familiar with,
Sure.
He's been looking at all of this stuff for longer than you or I. But he basically says that the key number is the oil price number, and it is the limit, and that we've kind of reached that limit. And now, as you're pointing out, it goes back and forth, a little above, a little below, but he says that's the critical thing. Now, having brought up Lester Brown, he also talks about the outrageous inflation in commodity prices of food.
That's right.
Now, how much of that is linked to, I'm going to ask you two things.
Yeah.
How much of that is linked to energy prices, and how much of it is linked to speculation moving to commodities like food because the other things they were speculating in, sovereign debt for one, oil for another, and real estate for another, are not paying off the way they used to?
Well, first of all, we are in the last bubble now, which is a commodities bubble. But that said, the reason that some of these commodity prices are rising has to do as much with scarcity as it does with speculation. And that's certainly the case with food. Over the past few years, the price of food has risen and fallen almost in lockstep with the price of oil, and that's because we've created a food system that's so overwhelmingly dependent on oil for transporting food inputs and food outputs, for processing fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and all the rest. But then there's another influence on food prices, which brings us into that third D, that third basket of factors, disaster. Mm-hmm. And that's that we're seeing weird weather that's destroying crops all across the planet. And that's forcing food prices up as well. We're talking about floods in Pakistan, droughts in Russia and the southwestern U.S. The examples just go on and on. But that is forcing up food prices also, and it's leading to the problems in social cohesion around the country. People who can no longer afford to buy food, especially people in poor countries with a rapidly increasing population. Very often, food is a very large part of their income, food expenditures. So when food prices double for these people, that's really the end of the rope, and they have no choice but to go out in the street and start to protest.
Yeah.
So that's what we're seeing in the Middle East and North Africa, and now starting to see in Greece and Ireland, and now we're starting to see on Wall Street. And
exactly, we will talk about that. Let me ask one other thing. It seems to me you said it's people for whom food is a big part of their spending, but it's also people where if the price of rice goes up, it doesn't send the price of Rice Krispies up that much.
Right.
I mean, you know what I'm saying here.
Yes.
Because the price of Rice Krispies, very little of it has to do with rice. Most of it has to do with packaging, advertising, etc. However, when you live on rice or wheat or barley or any of these things, when that price goes up, in America, it's a little drop in the bucket. We hardly see it because it's a little piece of a product. But where you are eating the unrefined, fresh stuff, that is where it's killer.
That's right.
So those who have kept it as simple as it could be actually are getting hurt worse, which seems to be of course everything's unfair, but it seems to be more than unfair. We're at the halfway point. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Richard HEINBERG, author of The End of Growth: Adapting to Our New Economic Reality. And to learn more, you can go to richardheinberg.com, HEINBERG, or postcarbon.org. Let's see. So yeah, I was going to say I appreciate debt, depletion, and disaster. That you're saying they are all coming to a head. And let me ask you, what this means to you. As you say, you were looking at energy for years and looking at environment for years, and suddenly you were forced to focus more on economics.
Right.
Obviously, we can talk about the faulty measures of economics, like GDP. Is there anything you'd like to say to bridge us from what we've just been saying to that conversation?
Yeah, well, you started out asking me what this means to me, and this goes to what I think I really learned in the process of writing this book and interviewing all of the former Wall Street insiders that I continue to keep in touch with. And that is that even though climate change is the greatest problem facing humanity because it's going to impact not only ourselves but children, grandchildren, other species for hundreds and thousands of years to come. And even though resource depletion is a fundamental economic limit that's going to change the world and our lives as we know them in profound ways, in some ways the most ephemeral of our problems, which is debt, is probably going to impact us soonest and foremost. It's kind of ironic in a way because the debt problem ultimately could be solved with just a matter of reorganizing our economies, reinventing banking, rethinking our currency system. A few things like that could solve the debt problem, but unfortunately, it's a system that is almost on a hair trigger. It's a system that can collapse quickly and almost completely to the point where nothing works anymore. You go to the ATM and your debit card doesn't work, your credit card doesn't work, you can't buy or sell. This has happened to countries throughout history who've reached these kinds of credit or debt crises. And with what's going on in Europe right now, there's a very strong likelihood that we will see something like that unfold on a global basis over the course of the next few years.
Mm-hmm. So let's return then to that notion of GDP. GDP has been used as a sort of kind of stand-in for welfare, well-being, quality of life, and so on, when really what we know is it's just adding up transactions and money that changes hands and so on. How much is that a piece of the problem now, and how does your thinking in adapting to the new economic reality look at measurements that could deal better with what's currently going on?
Yeah, well, I think it's enormously important because if I'm right, if we're at the end of conventional economic growth, that means that all attempts to increase GDP are futile. And politicians who are banging the drum saying, I can make the economy grow, are basically lying, regardless of whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or whoever. Well, what does that mean if as a society we can no longer set goals and attain them? Well, it's a crisis. It means we have to set different kinds of goals that we can achieve. And in fact, GDP is, as you implied, it's a perverse indicator, and not only economists, but even a few courageous politicians like Robert F. Kennedy pointed this out for a very long time. So what we need to do is abandon GDP altogether, whether we do it immediately or through a process that takes a couple of years, and adopt more robust indicators that have to do with quality of life, the integrity of the environment, the things that really matter. How well are we taking care of our poor? How are we educating our children? How few people are in prison? How peaceful is our society? If we make those our goals, we can achieve those goals without increasing our consumption of resources. And if we have those as goals, then we can have the collective sense that we're moving in a direction, we're making progress, and life is getting better. even though by GDP measures things may be falling apart, and they will be.
Yeah, and so it's one, if we actually realize that, I think what you're saying is if we actually realize that all of this debt and all of this consumption and all of this spending, not only is it going to be impossible, but it wasn't bringing us fulfillment, happiness,
Right.
etc. Anyway, it wasn't bringing us quality. It was about quantity. That shift how that is going to happen. You may be familiar with Thomas Homer Dixon.
Yes.
And when he wrote several years ago, the upside of down, he basically said, I had thought we would turn things around because we'd be smart enough, and now I think it'll take a crash. Well, now we've been, we're at this crash that, as you point out, and so many point out, if Europe fails to finesse this situation they've gotten themselves into, the next one, as we said earlier in the conversation, which could happen soon, could be worse than the last one. And
Right.
each time they get harder and harder to get out of because there are feedback loops involved.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think about some of the, again, we're talking about the new economics, what do you think about the Capital Institute, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, some of the work that some of those folks are doing? I've interviewed Rob Johnson of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I will certainly do so with Fullerton of the Capital Institute. First, what do you think of them? And B, are we going to move quick enough?
Yeah, well, these people are doing admirable work, and I interviewed many of them for the book.
Mm-hmm, I know.
John Fullerton is a brilliant guy. He was the managing director of J.P. Morgan for a number of years back in the 90s, and it was interesting talking to him because he has this memory of Wall Street as being a place where people did play by the rules, and there was a sense of honor about it all. And he looks at what's going on in Wall Street now and for the past few years, and it seems almost unrecognizable.
Well, one of the things that we didn't talk about as a transition point, but I have talked about with others, is first there was the Glass-Steagall thing, right? We know that. But the other thing was investment houses used to be privately owned. Up until, I think, the mid-'80s was when that first began to shift. You used to be playing with your own money.
Right.
And when they shifted to public and you were now, playing with someone else's money, I think that was the start. And I had a conversation with Michael Lewis, who wrote Lyra's Poker based on the time of that shift.
That's right.
And he definitely said, that's when it started.
Right. And now we're in a situation where, say, the management of a huge institution like Bank of America are really not running it even for the shareholders. They're just running it basically for themselves and for their huge bonuses. And if they drive the entire institution in the ground, which they are doing, that's okay because they come out with their golden parachutes.
Yeah, inevitably. I'm going to throw at you something just kind of off the cuff, but last night I happened to hear a radio show that had two segments that just really struck me. It was the story, the one that it's an NPR show that tells stories. Last night one was a fellow named Coates who went from being a Wall Street trader to investigating the neuroscience of trading, and basically says what we're doing is what happens to young animals when they get pumped up with too much testosterone.
That's right.
There's a feedback loop there that they start taking riskier and riskier things, and eventually they, as he said, they wander into predator territory or they go out alone too much, and eventually they get killed. But that basically he has begun the testing of young traders and says it is absolutely what's happening.
Oh, yeah, I heard that confirmed over and over again. I spoke to a former hedge fund manager named Nate Hagens, who's gone on to get a PhD in ecological economics. And he talks about the dopamine response of trading, trading on Wall Street, the experience of being tied to a screen and watching those computer blips, representing in some cases millions or hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars, and feeling that dopamine hit every time, you make a trade. And he really thinks that we're going to have to find some other way of satisfying that dopamine response receptor if we're going to get away from this.
One of the things that
addiction.
Coates said is he said if we had more women and more elderly people somehow,
right.
if you somehow change the if you let people, he said it's tough to regulate each individual's behavior, but if you had a different mix, a different biological mix, it might help. The second story was about some folks from Papua New Guinea who had been, a group from Britain had gone to document them. And then the Papua New Guinea folks said, well, we want to go see your city. You came and saw ours. Where we live, we want to see where you live. And they take them to London.
Right.
And the simple story is, they spend time with a working class family. This is the one that stuck out for me the most. They ask the guy why he gets up every morning and goes to work wolfs down breakfast, goes to work at 7 a.m., comes home at 6 p.m. And they say, why do you leave your loved ones all day? Mm-hmm. Why do you do this? And he said, well, I'm paying for my house. They said, oh, okay, that makes sense. How long will you do this? And he says 30 years. And they go, what? They said, when we need a house, we call everyone in the village. Everyone gets together. We build a house in 3 weeks, and that's it.
That's it.
And hearing those two stories, one after another, was just, it was a bit of a mind blow.
Yeah. Well, in the book, I discuss also kind of the anthropology and the history of finance and money. Mm-hmm. And from a big historical perspective, if you go back to the very beginning, we lived in gift economies. When we were hunters and gatherers, we just shared everything because that was what we needed in order to survive. We needed to be able to trust one another, and sharing was the ticket to increasing levels of trust in a small community. But we did have trade. Trade was with strangers because trade is an inherently competitive activity. So you traded with other tribes, but you shared everything within your own tribe. And the whole history of economics, not economics as a discipline, but the history of economies from that time to the present is a long story of the gradual shrinking of the gift economy and the gradual growth of the trade economy through the invention of money and the invention of credit and debt and banking all the way up to the present. And we've really reached the end of that trajectory. I think we've commodified just about everything we possibly can in life. We've made child care and talking to somebody who is willing to listen to you. We've even commodified things like that.
Yeah.
And as the financial economy comes apart, and as we downsize it to its proper role within society, I think what's going to happen is we are going to have to return to more of a gift economy. There are certain ways in which the gift economy still survives in families and nonprofit organizations and churches, and that's it. That's the remnant. But I think it's going to have to play a much bigger part in our lives. We're going to have to volunteer a lot more, help out, and just share.
Mm-hmm. I'm Terrence McNally. That's Richard Heinberg, author of The End of Growth, and you can learn more at richardheinberg.com or postcarbon.org. Let's turn, if we can, we got about 13 minutes left, 12, 13 minutes, to we've done a lot in the diagnosis and the prognosis and a little bit in the prescription, but what do you see is the way forward? What are some of the steps that are going to turn this around?
Well, I think first we have to look at the debt crisis because, as I said earlier, that's going to hit us first and hardest of these 3 Ds. It's not that we can ignore the other two. We have to keep our eyes on climate change and resource depletion. But if we don't solve the debt crisis, we won't have much of an economy with which to address those other problems. So the debt crisis ultimately is going to be solved through some kind of default. And massive defaults on the part of consumers and homeowners and banks and just about everybody and governments. So it seems to me, and I think to an increasing number of informed observers, that this is going to go best if we organize it and if we make it as fair as possible. And that means just a general forgiveness of debt. like a debt jubilee
Mm-hmm.
on a massive scale. Haircuts for everybody is one way of putting this. And it would give us a chance to start over. Everyone would take a hit of some kind or another. Some people, probably the Wall Street folks, would take a bigger hit than anybody else, but after all, they probably deserve it. They got us into this mess.
Right, and they've done very well getting us here.
Yes. But somehow we have to shed these massive levels of debt and start over. And then once we've done that, then we really have to look at taking what financial resources we still have, and devoting them to a fundamental energy transition of society away from dependence on fossil fuels. Because that's going to happen anyway, whether we plan for it or not. But if we don't plan for it, it's going to be very, very tragic.
In some sense, that applies to both of these things, doesn't it?
That's right.
The debt crisis, we can say, is not as inevitable as the energy shift, but it probably is. And so in both cases, if we can plan for them and organize in a cooperative fashion to deal with them, rather than in a absolutely competitive fashion.
That's right.
And let me go back to something I raised at the very start of the interview, Richard, which was your book, A New Covenant with Nature.
Yeah.
And I remember you laid out, I think it was 3 paths forward. One was that business as usual, in which case we end up in a terrible crisis. Mm-hmm. One was adaptation, in which we actually find a new way to go. And the other was, as I think it was, the rich get richer and buy more weapons and more security, and the rest get poorer. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember that book. It sounds a bit like you're talking about a more recent book of mine called Power Down.
Well, you did it in Power Down as well. In Power Down, you had 4 possible scenarios.
That's right. Well, you remember better than I do. Yeah, A New Covenant with Nature was published back in 1996, so memory's a little hazy in my mind right now.
But so what I'm saying, I think, is you've been thinking about these scenarios for a long time, these various paths. It seems like whenever one does that, one sort of says, well, here's the warning, there is this good option, but the longer we delay it, the more likely we are in, the bad option or the worse option. And so basically, if I were going to say, it really does seem like we've moved, that we've moved towards, without the moat necessarily, we do, and I'm taking this now to the Occupy movements, where we talk about 99% and 1%.
That's right.
And where do you see them fitting into all of this?
Well, I think of the Occupy movement as the end of growth uprising. I don't think it would have happened if growth hadn't come to an end. And I think the fact that we're not seeing economic growth is causing an enormous amount of human misery, and people are responding to that in the only way they can. We talked about the growth of corruption in both the financial industry and our political system earlier, and people see that. They see that the bankers are being bailed out, and they're not. And at this point, their only recourse is to go out into the street. And frankly, I think that's our only hope. If, in fact, our political system is completely corrupted so that all 3 branches of government have been bought and sold to the highest bidder, I think that's pretty much the case.
I think so, too.
If that's true,
accurate description.
Yeah, if that's true, then only a force from outside the political system is going to help. We can't do it just at the ballot box. We have to get out in the street.
And I guess, this is not maybe the time to unfold that whole scenario, but it seems to me that I guess eventually the street affects the behavior of politicians who at this point have been fooling you into buying a vote once every 2 years or 4 years and working for their owners the rest of the time.
Yeah, we're in a situation where fundamental economic and political reform is required, but the politicians are unwilling to undertake that. They'd rather paper over the situation, kick the can down the road, pretend that recovery is on the way. And they will continue to do that until their feet are held to the fire, until they're required by the masses of people showing their displeasure that they actually have to grasp these problems and do something about them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, we've heard for, it seems to me, 15 years, maybe longer, but a growing thing about the disconnect between the Beltway mentality, how they don't seem to see what's actually going on. Their opinions don't mesh. Conventional wisdom within the Beltway doesn't mesh with actually what, the people want, the people believe, and so on. And it sort of was like it was ongoing. But at a crisis point, that becomes a very big deal.
Right. And there's no guarantee that they will respond even to folks in the street. There's a very strong likelihood that they'll respond with repression and just try to make that problem go away. But of course it won't. As long as the economy is getting worse, more and more people will be desperate, and repression will just result in rapid social decay. Now, it is possible for the policymakers to do things different, to take an active role in solving these fundamental economic and ecological problems. And I think that's the role of an organization like Post-Carbon Institute, which I work for, is to try to make sure that there are policies out there on the table that can be grasped at a moment's notice to turn things around. There's no guarantee that they will be, though.
Okay. And finally, if you were just going to say in a couple of 2-3 minutes, what people should be you just did it with Post-Carbon Institute, but where people should be looking, besides their local Occupy movement, where people should be looking, what they should be thinking about, how they should be responding to this situation we're in.
Well, every community has some kind of alternative economic infrastructure, whether it's a rideshare program or a local food network or credit union. These have been alternative up to this point. From here on, that is going to be our lifeline. We need to make sure that these alternative institutions survive and thrive. I'm talking about taking your money out of the big Wall Street bank, if you have it there, and putting it into your local credit union. I'm talking about joining a local car share or ride share network and making sure that other people know that these opportunities are available. We need to be volunteering our time to help these institutions survive, and also getting to know our neighbors. Become more self-sufficient, consume less. Keep chickens in your backyard and share eggs with your neighbors.
Co-housing.
Absolutely, yes. All of these things we've been talking about for a long time.
As sort of alternatives off to the edge.
As alternatives.
There. Yeah.
Now they have to become the mainstream.
Okay. So the new book is The End of Growth, Adapting to Our New Economic Reality. You can learn more at richardheinberg.com or postcarbon.org. A couple of other, if you just wanted to throw me a couple of other books or websites people should look at.
Yeah, well, we have another website which is called energybulletin.net. And it's a great website because it has news and opinion pieces that are updated on a daily basis. So I go there first thing every morning, energybulletin.net. And
then you have a newsletter, right? And if that, as I said that quickly, you probably didn't understand what I meant. MUSELETTER. People can subscribe to that at
by going to richardheinberg.com, and it's free. It's free by email.
Okay, very good. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime during the week by linking to our podcast. You can sign up to have it delivered to you weekly. For podcast articles and transcripts of interviews, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY, terrencemcnally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. And at that website or at iTunes, you can get the podcast or sign up to have them delivered to you weekly at the site or by emailing me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY, temcnally@mac.com. You can get a weekly announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually 2 or 3 articles of background information on the topic. And finally, thank you. It's great talking to you again, Richard Heinberg. Keep up the good work.
Well, thank you, Terence. You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.